So the history of the saxophone in the orchestra is the center of the work revisions. Talk about how the saxophone has and has not been a part of this, standard classical music ensemble.
So the way that I remember it is that in Europe, the instrument kind of got held back mostly by the reputation of its creator. That Adolf Sax was kind of a difficult man. He was kind of arrogant, and I think he knew how important his work was, and it kind of put people off a little bit. And people felt threatened by the saxophone and the change that it could bring to the scene. And so their distrust in that change and their distrust in the saxophone kind of manifested in just trying to do whatever they could to keep it away. And there's some fun stories about the French instrument makers and Adolf and recruiting people to play the instruments and judge which one was better and so on. But a little bit more interested in the American context. And so by the early 20th century, the saxophone had been, I think, pretty widely adopted by jazz idioms, and the classical world at that time, and maybe even still into the present, wasn't necessarily super welcoming of different expressions of music outside of the European tradition of the classics and the canon. And so instruments or styles of music that were outside of that didn't really find a way in. And in fact, it seemed that people were actively trying to make sure that those kinds of music didn't make it in. And there were some other people who were very much interested in trying to find ways to synthesize them. But by and large, it seemed that it was something that people were very interested in trying to keep separate. And so you have a handful of pieces here and there that use the saxophone as a solo instrument, mostly from European composers. But in America, it seems the only time that you really come across saxophone and orchestra is something that is very clearly supposed to be a fusion of jazz and classical, or something from the 20th or 21st century that is, more contemporary.
I think we hear a lot of transcriptions too, like WUOL listeners would probably be most familiar with it from, there's an album from Jess Gillum, two albums actually from the English saxophonist Jess Gillum. And then we have a Branford Marsalis album, and they do a lot of pieces that were written for them, but also their version of an existing piece for another instrument. I also think it's interesting that so many Russian composers used it. Like, I think of Mussorgsky first. I think of Pictures at an Exhibition. And then the Duke Ellington, Three Black Kings, and the second movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty big part, right? So what are some favorite orchestral works of yours that use the instrument?
So really the one that comes to mind is the symphonic dances, the Rachmaninoff, and that has that huge saxophone solo in the first movement, I believe. I've performed in that one, and it's a great use of the saxophone. It has this very melancholic, very lyric, beautiful, sad Russian melody. And then, actually, I was just having a discussion with someone the other night about maybe what the earliest orchestral piece was that had a full section of saxophones, and we kind of were toying with the idea of Symphonia Domestica. And I don't know if there's an orchestral score that predates that has a actual full section of saxophones. But even in that score, you can see Strauss kind of struggling. The saxophones aren't used very often. I don't think they're ever used as a unit. They're kind of sprinkled across the orchestration in a way that seems a little confused. And I could understand maybe why he would be confused, because there wasn't a lot of precedent at that point, especially for a full section. Yeah.
So what were you excited to have the saxophone do?
So this kind of really gets to the root of a lot of my my interest in the way that I approach composing and thinking about the instruments is that I want to try to figure out what's kind of like the definition of the instrument or how it's used, what its idioms are and those kinds of things, and seeing how I can manipulate those. And so the saxophone, the way that I understand it, is an instrument that was created to, one, blend with orchestral instruments, two, to be agile and facile, but also still have the power and projection of a brass instrument. And yeah, I guess those are the two things mainly. And so when I do think about the saxophone, I do think about it as an instrument that is associated with lots of facility. That can really move and has a lot of power. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to demonstrate that in my piece, but also I was really interested in the idea of finding ways to tap into the more subtle and vocal sides of the instrument, and to really, really explore the ways in which that it can blend with the orchestral instruments. So actually, one of the important moments in the piece is that the saxophone quartet actually ends up making friends with the string quartet. And so there's this octet of blended voices. And, you know, I basically wanted it to seem as though the saxophone could come in and out of that texture, or a violin could come in and out of this texture, and you wouldn't necessarily know which instrument is doing which in this moment of like really a subtle blending, color blending.
It is an instrument, as you said, that has the projection power of a brass instrument. And as far as woodwind instruments go, it really does have a ton of agility, even compared to its other counterparts in the section. What were the orchestration challenges of making the most of this instrument's capabilities when it could really overpower everyone if you didn't quite balance it?
Sure. So actually, I found having the full saxophone section in the orchestra to be more liberating than anything, because actually I was talking with Teddy about this, that this is getting a little specific, but that's okay. When you start getting into the low end of the treble clef, the orchestral wind instruments that can kind of play down there, that kind of start to lack projection, like the low end of the clarinet. You're not going to get a ton of projection out of there. That's kind of the mid register of the bassoon, maybe mid upper register, yeah, mid. And you know, and now that I'm thinking of, there's not really, the other orchestral winds don't really go there. So the saxophones, that's like their meat and potatoes range. So it actually helps really beef up this register that can kind of be neglected. That register is filled in by instruments like the horn and the trombone, and that's excellent. And I'm a horn player. As much as I love horns and everything, they don't quite have the same kind of facility that you would associate with a saxophone, right? That nimble quality. So I actually found that I was able to do more with what I wanted in those registers. But yeah, it's the challenge for me wasn't necessarily that I was afraid that I would overpower the other orchestral instruments. It was how can I still sort of showcase these instruments in an orchestral context, without it just kind of seeming like I'm just doing things to do things. I wanted to make sure that everything had a lot of purpose and served sort of the expressive trajectory of the piece.
You mentioned talking to Teddy Abrams about fitting everything together. You've written a piece for the Louisville Orchestra before, and this time you're doing it as part of the Creators Corps, and you're in residence with the orchestra, and you've got two fellow composers around you to talk with as well. How has the experience been different?
Oh man. Well, you know, it's certainly been an extremely positive experience with being here with Lisa and TJ. You know, I'd say that our connection goes beyond just being a cohort. I would say that it's accurate to say that we're pretty close friends. We're in contact with each other, you know, if not every day, and most days, through the group chat or just seeing each other. Of course, we're all here located in Shelby Park, very close to each other. But the kind of support that comes from that, just from social support and also just from collegial musical support and sharing these experiences with these people, has been so fulfilling and super important for me. So, and also this way of working with the orchestra is obviously, you know, over a much longer period of time. So the connections that you get to make and the things that you kind of get to do are a little bit different than, you know, say the last time that I worked with the orchestra. It was a pretty short, quick turnaround. I think I had about 3 weeks to write them their piece and turn everything in. So it was pretty quick. And that was a short piece too. It ended up being only 4 minutes. You know, that was what was asked. And this piece is much bigger. You know, it's almost I think it's a 14-minute piece, triple wind orchestra with the full section of saxophones. So and I really felt like this, after having the experience I had in, I want to say it was October, when we did the readings with the LO. I gave them my dissertation, and they sight read it, and you know, I thought, you know, this is such a difficult piece, and to hear them to go through it that way, I was like, well, I won't have to hold back, right? I can really go full force in the things that I'm interested in. And so revisions does exactly that. But yeah,
even more yourself. Your advice to young composers the last time I talked to you was to listen voraciously, consume music, consume sounds. Now, you've been with 2 other composers hanging out, you've been around the orchestra a lot. What have you heard?
Oh, this is a great question. I've heard a lot of things. Now you're putting me on the spot a little bit because I have to think about what specifically.
It's kind of a did you take your own advice kind
Yeah,
of question.
yeah.
We
I
don't
like.
always do that.
No, I definitely, you know, I've been to all of the concerts that I've been able to go to, and you know, maybe one of the most interesting experiences that I can remember is the Thomas Addison 7 Days. That was spectacular. You know, I've heard some of his other work, and I remember his previous piano concerto. But I think actually most of the listening that I do in that regard is stuff that I end up happening across on YouTube, scrolling score videos of composers, the completely obscure composers from the 19th century, no one's ever heard of, or composers who are alive and writing today. And so I think, yes, the answer is I have been taking my own advice. I've been listening lots, but I unfortunately am not able to give a lot of specifics.
Well, outside of the orchestra and outside of your cohort, what, even for fun, have you been listening to lately?
So I've kind of been in a Strauss kick right now. And I think sometimes that surprises people because they hear my music and they hear the composers that I really admire, and I don't think they would default to someone like Strauss.
You mean Richard Strauss?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. There's an album that was released not too long ago, that is all of Strauss's orchestral works, including the burlesque for piano and orchestra, and the tone poems. And it's phenomenal. It's such a great album. So I've been really interested in Don Quixote and Zarathustra. Some of the ones maybe that get overlooked, you know, as a horn player, we know Heldenleben and we know Till very well. But it's not every day that you get to hear, you know, Don Quixote or Zarathustra. So yeah, those are 2 of my favorites right now. They're just fascinating pieces. And to think also that Zarathustra was written, I think, yeah, in the late 19th century. Right. So like, you know, predates the Rite of Spring. You know, some of those, the harmonies and just everything that he was asking for, the size of the orchestra, the technique, it's such a demanding piece, and I think it's fascinating. The subject matter is really interesting as well.